I have always been a solitary person. My job allows me to work remotely, so I often spend my autumn months renting Airbnbs in secluded locations to focus on my writing. I prefer places that are isolated, cabins in the mountains, cottages on the coast, places where I can go days without seeing another human face. It helps me concentrate, or at least it used to. Last November, I found a listing for a large A-frame cabin in the Adirondack Mountains of upstate New York. The photos were stunning. It had floor-to-ceiling windows looking out over a private lake, a massive stone fireplace, and a wraparound deck. The reviews were glowing, though I noticed they were all from a few years ago. The listing had a new host badge, which usually meant the property had recently changed hands. The price was surprisingly low for the peak foliage season, but I didn't question it. I booked it for 2 weeks. The drive up was grueling. The GPS took me down a series of winding dirt roads that got progressively narrower and rougher. By the time I reached the driveway, my phone had lost all service. I was truly off the grid. The cabin was even more impressive in person than in the photos. It was a towering structure of dark timber and glass, sitting alone in a clearing of dense pines. I retrieved the key from the lockbox, the code was provided in the app, and let myself in. The interior smelled of pine sap and wood smoke, a smell that I initially found comforting. It was silent, dead silent, the kind of silence that presses against your ears. I spent the first few hours unpacking my groceries and setting up my workspace on the large oak table facing the lake. The first oddity occurred on the second night. I was sitting by the fire, reading a book. It was around 11 p.m. The wind had picked up outside, whistling through the trees and rattling the large glass panes of the living room. I was used to the sounds of old houses settling, the pops, the groans of timber contracting in the cold. But then I heard something different. It was a soft, rhythmic thud. It sounded like it was coming from the floor beneath me. The cabin had a basement, but the listing explicitly stated that the basement was used for storage and was locked off to guests. I lowered my book and listened. Thud, thud, thud. It was faint, muffled by the heavy rug and the floorboards, but it was rhythmic. It didn't sound like a pipe knocking or a branch hitting the siding. It sounded like footsteps. Slow, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth directly underneath my chair. I sat frozen for a moment, my heart rate spiking. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a loose shutter banging against the foundation. I stood up and walked to the window, cupping my hands against the glass to see outside. It was pitch black. I couldn't see the foundation from this angle. I grabbed a flashlight from my emergency kit and decided to check the basement door. It was located in the kitchen, a heavy solid wood door with a deadbolt. I approached it slowly. The deadbolt was engaged. I tried the handle. Locked. I put my ear against the wood. Silence. The thudding had stopped. I convinced myself it was just the boiler or the water heater acting up. I went back to the living room, put another log on the fire, and turned up the volume on my music to drown out the silence. I didn't sleep well that night. I kept waking up, thinking I heard the sound of a door latch clicking open, but every time I sat up, the room was empty. 3 days passed without incident. I fell into a routine. I would wake up, write until noon, go for a hike, and spend the evenings reading. I began to relax. The isolation felt less threatening and more peaceful. On the 5th day, I went for a longer hike than usual. I circled the lake, exploring the dense woods on the other side of the property. When I returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long, stretching shadows across the yard. As I walked up the driveway, I stopped. I was staring at the front of the cabin. The large A-frame windows reflected the sunset. But something was wrong. In the topmost window, the small triangular window at the very peak of the roof, which looked into the loft bedroom where I was sleeping, the curtains were closed. I distinctly remembered opening them that morning. I always opened them to let the light in while I made the bed. A cold shiver ran down my spine, despite the heavy coat I was wearing. Had I forgotten? I was meticulous about my routine. Maybe the cleaning lady had come by. But the host hadn't mentioned a cleaning service during my stay. I walked up the steps to the deck, my boots heavy on the wood. I tried the front door. It was locked. just as I had left it. I unlocked it and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed in the high ceilings. Silence. I did a sweep of the ground floor. The kitchen was undisturbed. My laptop was still on the table. Nothing seemed missing. I walked up the stairs to the loft bedroom. The curtains were indeed drawn tight, blocking out the light. I walked over and opened them. The dust motes danced in the sudden beam of sunlight. I checked the closet. My clothes were hanging exactly where I left them. I checked under the bed. Nothing. I spent the next hour convincing myself that I must have closed them without thinking. It was a muscle memory thing, right? I was just being paranoid because of the isolation. 3 days passed without incident. I fell into a routine. I would wake up, write until noon, go for a hike, and spend the evenings reading. I began to relax. The isolation felt less threatening and more peaceful. On the 5th day, I went for a longer hike than usual. I circled the lake, exploring the dense woods on the other side of the property. When I returned to the cabin, it was late afternoon. The sun was already dipping below the tree line, casting long, stretching shadows across the yard. As I walked up the driveway, I stopped. I was staring at the front of the cabin. The large A-frame windows reflected the sunset. But something was wrong. In the topmost window, the small triangular window at the very peak of the roof, which looked into the loft bedroom where I was sleeping, the curtains were closed. I distinctly remembered opening them that morning. I always opened them to let the light in while I made the bed. A cold shiver ran down my spine, despite the heavy coat I was wearing. Had I forgotten? I was meticulous about my routine. Maybe the cleaning lady had come by. But the host hadn't mentioned a cleaning service during my stay. I walked up the steps to the deck, my boots heavy on the wood. I tried the front door. It was locked, just as I had left it. I unlocked it and stepped inside. "Hello?" I called out. My voice echoed in the high ceilings. Silence. I did a sweep of the ground floor. The kitchen was undisturbed. My laptop was still on the table. Nothing seemed missing. I walked up the stairs to the loft bedroom. The curtains were indeed drawn tight, blocking out the light. I walked over and opened them. The dust motes danced in the sudden beam of sunlight. I checked the closet. My clothes were hanging exactly where I left them. I checked under the bed. Nothing. I spent the next hour convincing myself that I must have closed them without thinking. It was a muscle memory thing, right? I was just being paranoid because of the isolation. That night, the temperature dropped significantly. The cabin grew cold, despite the fire. I went to the thermostat in the hallway to turn up the heat. It was an old analog dial. I set it to 70 degrees and waited for the furnace to kick in. I waited 5 minutes, 10 minutes. The vents remained silent. I sighed, realizing I would have to go check the breaker box. I searched the hallway and the utility closet, but I couldn't find the panel. Then I remembered the basement. The utilities would be down there. I really didn't want to go down there. The memory of those thudding footsteps was still fresh in my mind, but I was freezing, and I wasn't going to sleep in a 40-degree house. I took the key ring that the host had left in the lockbox. There were 2 keys on it, one for the front door and a smaller brass one that I hadn't used yet. I stood in front of the heavy basement door in the kitchen. I inserted the brass key. It turned with a heavy clunk. I opened the door. A rush of stale, musty air hit me. It smelled of mildew and something else, something metallic, like copper. I shined my flashlight down the stairs. They were unfinished wood, steep and narrow. "Hello?" I called out again, feeling foolish. I descended the stairs, the wood creaking loudly under my weight. I reached the bottom and swept the light around. It was a typical unfinished basement. Concrete floors, exposed insulation, cardboard boxes stacked in corners. In the center of the room was the furnace and the water heater. I walked over to the furnace. The pilot light was out. As I knelt down to inspect it, my flashlight beam swept across the far wall. I froze. In the corner of the basement, tucked behind a stack of old paint cans, was a sleeping bag. It wasn't rolled up in storage. It was laid out on the concrete floor, and it looked occupied. There was a shape inside it. My breath caught in my throat. I stood up slowly, backing away. I kept the light trained on the sleeping bag. "Who's there?" I whispered. The shape in the sleeping bag didn't move. I took another step back, my boot scuffing against the concrete. Suddenly, the sleeping bag deflated. It flattened out. It was empty. The shape inside had just been bunched up fabric to make it look full. But then I saw it. Next to the sleeping bag was a small camping stove, a few empty cans of beans, and a monitor. A small, battery-powered LCD monitor sitting on a crate. I stepped closer, compelled by a horrified curiosity. The monitor was glowing faintly. It showed a black and white image. It was a view of the living room upstairs. I was looking at the empty chair, where I had been sitting reading every night. The camera was positioned high up, likely hidden in a vent or a smoke detector. There was a second screen. It showed the loft bedroom, my bed. Someone had been living down here. Someone had been watching me sleep, watching me write, watching me live. Then, from the darkness behind the furnace, the area I hadn't checked yet, I heard a sound. It was the sound of a lungful of air being exhaled. Long, shaky, and wet. Ha! It came from less than 5 feet away. I didn't turn to look. I didn't scream. My body reacted on pure instinct. I spun around and sprinted for the stairs. As my foot hit the first step, I heard a rush of movement behind me, a frantic scrambling of boots on concrete, a guttural snarl that didn't sound entirely human. I flew up the stairs, stumbling, scraping my shins on the sharp wood. I felt a hand brush the heel of my boot just as I threw myself through the doorway into the kitchen. I slammed the heavy door and threw the deadbolt. Bam! A body slammed into the door from the other side with tremendous force. The wood groaned. The door rattled in the frame. Bam! Bam! "Let me in!" A voice screamed from the basement. It was raw and raspy. "It's cold! Let me in!" I backed away, grabbing a chef's knife from the magnetic strip on the wall. I ran to the front door, fumbling with the lock. My hands were shaking so badly I dropped my keys. The pounding in the kitchen stopped. Then, silence. I scooped up the keys and unlocked the front door. As I ran out into the cold night air toward my car, I looked back at the house. In the living room window, the big glass pane overlooking the deck, a man was standing there. He must have come up through a secondary exit, maybe a bulkhead door outside that I hadn't seen. He was gaunt, with long, matted hair. He was wearing one of my flannel shirts that I had left on the couch. He stood there, pressing his hand against the glass, smiling a wide, toothless smile as he watched me fumble with my car door. I drove down that mountain at reckless speeds, risking running off the cliff at every turn. I didn't get service until I hit the main highway an hour later. When the state police arrived at the cabin, the man was gone. But they found the setup in the basement. They found months' worth of trash. And they found a journal. It was filled with entries describing the guests. He wrote about what they ate, what they watched on TV, and what they looked like when they slept. The entry, for me, was the last one. It was short. "He listens too much. He hears the floor. I have to be quieter tonight when I go up to watch him." The scariest part? The police found a hidden crawlspace access panel in the closet of the loft bedroom. It wasn't screwed shut. The hinges were oiled. He hadn't just been watching me on the monitors. On those nights when I heard the creaking, he had been in the room with me, just inches away behind the wall, waiting for me to fall asleep.